years ago, I really wanted to lose weight. I collected data and brainstormed the potential causes for my current weight. I had so many things to try, I was completely overwhelmed and didn't know where to start. I ended up dabbling with lots of different experiments, and it was no surprise when my efforts just petered out. Learn from my mistake. None of us have time and energy to work on every single root cause, so we need to figure out how to make the best use of our time. Instead of dabbling and assuming like I did, figure out the most important causes and try out just a couple of powerful changes. This video builds on your knowledge of writing SMART goals and analyzing root causes covered in our previous videos. By the end of the video, you will be able to prioritize all of your potential root causes into the vital few factors using a Pareto chart and prioritization matrix, and differentiate when to use statistics. This is one of my favorite parts of a project, where you narrow down your focus and pick what to work on. So, how do you pick what to work on? Focus on causes that will happen the most often, have the most impact, or that you have the most control over. Let's start by learning how to prioritize a problem to solve based on what happens most often. We are often trying to understand why something happens or doesn't happen, and which are the most common reasons. The first step is to collect the causes and track how frequently they happen. Sometimes you can pull a report and get the data you need, but many times you will need to develop a tracker in order to get useful data. Take the time to set up an adequate tracker. Otherwise, you risk ending up with too little data recorded or reasons that are too confusing to make sense of. Let's look at an example of an improvement project that struggled in using a tracker. Imagine you work in a lab inundated with calls. Staff are trying to get work done, but are constantly pulled out of flow to answer calls, and they get behind in their work. To learn why people are calling, you ask staff to document how many of each type of call they get each day for a week. You shadow a lab assistant who has a huge stack of lab samples to process. The phone rings, breaking their concentration. They answer the phone, focusing on how to answer the question, and still trying to remember where they were in processing the lab samples. At this point, they forget they were supposed to document the reasons for the call, and they didn't really understand the tracker in the first place. So they do what they normally do and focus on answering the question in the call and getting back to work. Oh my, no wonder this team didn't tally anywhere near the number of calls they expected. Here are a couple suggestions to implement a tracker that makes it easier to collect data. First, provide a physical or digital tracker and include it in a list of the most common reasons and an other category. This way, all users have to do is tally and not think about what to write. Use your root cause analysis to come up with the potential reasons, and run them by the people who will do the tracking to make sure these are the main reasons and the wording makes sense to them. The reasons are often not the final root cause, but something further up the causal chain. At this point, you're looking for trends of what to cut and what to focus on. You'll come back to the detailed root causes later. Second, work with users to figure out when the documentation best fits into their workflow. In our lab example, the lab assistant missed tracking a data point because there was a lot going on, and there wasn't an easy place in their workflow to document the call. This is a very common issue. In hindsight, they could have used their daily huddle to work out a process that placed a tracker next to every phone, making it easy to document during the phone call. Once you have your frequency data, build a Pareto chart. Pareto charts are great to help you see which reasons are most common and help you prioritize the top couple to make the biggest impact. Let's look at an example where an inpatient team wanted to work on increasing use of best practices to decrease surgical site infections. In order to figure out where to focus, they observed the process using their standard checklist and tallied how many times the best practice was missed. Then they created a Pareto chart to figure out where to focus. They counted how many misses there were in each category and sorted biggest to smallest. The data displayed in the chart shows the classic 80-20 rule, also known as the Pareto principle by Wilfred Pareto, whereby 80% of the issues are caused by 20% of the problems. If a team works on that top 20%, they should be able to greatly reduce the issues. Let me introduce you to Janine Johnson to tell you about this project.
The project that I worked on was looking at an increase in the rate of surgical site infections in patients who had undergone cesarean sections. We had received some information that the rate had increased over the last year, and so we wanted to undertake some kind of intervention to hopefully reduce the rate of infections in our patients. In order to prioritize where we could focus our efforts, we created a Pareto chart, and that was just a sort of simple, elegant way to display what were the most commonly missed elements of the bundle. We started our project with a list of elements that are part of a surgical site infection prevention bundle. That was what we used to populate our Pareto chart. So those items were things that we observed firsthand in the operating room, and we counted the number of times each of the elements was missed. In the process of creating our Pareto chart, we were somewhat surprised to discover that the most commonly missed element of our surgical site infection prevention bundle was hand hygiene. And I don't necessarily think that's where we would have started had we not taken the opportunity to do observations and then compile our data and sort it and look at it in that format. The outcome is that after we were able to add those additional sanitizer dispensers, we noticed a pretty significant increase in the number of times that staff were appropriately utilizing the dispensers to perform hand hygiene. In any setting, but particularly in healthcare, we have limited resources. We have limited time resources, limited people resources, and by prioritizing which interventions we could potentially impact, we're then able to better use our resources to focus on the things that are most likely to reduce the rate of infections in our case.
Let's move on to the second type of data analysis, which measures impact using statistical analysis. I'm not going to show you how to do these statistical tests. My goal is to show you what you can learn from doing a chi-square test or a t-test, and to use that knowledge to help you choose. If either of these tests sound like what you need, but you are not comfortable with stats yourself, then this point in your project would be a great time to meet with an improvement professional. A very common statistical analysis in healthcare is to see if there is a difference between groups of categorical data, such as binary categories, or groupings like low, medium, and high. To answer this question, use a chi-squared or a two-proportion test. Use chi-squared if there are multiple groups, and two-proportion tests if there are only two groups. In my weight loss example, I tracked everything I ate and I started with a Pareto chart. That chart showed that I consumed too many calories in junk food and dessert. So I looked into whether there were days of the week or times of the day that were harder for me. I expected that I had more junk food and dessert on weekends, so I did a chi-square test by day to check. I had a bit more on Friday and Saturday, but not significantly more, so I moved on to look at time of day. I found a difference there. The chi-squared test showed me that my evening snack was the most likely time for me to eat bad calories, and that when I had an evening snack, it was almost always bad for me, with very little variability. I had expected my breakfast to be a problem because of elaborate weekend breakfasts with my sons, but the chi-squared test showed that wasn't one of my vital few causes. In my previous diet efforts, as I said earlier, I dabbled with different strategies, including experimenting with breakfast. This time, thanks to my chi-squared test, I knew that focusing on my evening snack would have a stronger impact because it is one of my vital few causes. The other type of statistical analysis popular in healthcare improvement work are ANOVA or t-tests. These are similar in function to chi-squared tests, but are used when your data are continuous, such as time or money, instead of categorical. These are used to compare the averages of different samples to assess for statistical difference between groups. Use t-tests to compare two groups, and ANOVA for three or more. For example, a clinical team trying to decrease the number of days from referral to consult expected to see that incoming referrals from outside the system, took longer than internal referrals from within the system. But upon conducting a t-test, they learned that those samples were not statistically different. That knowledge meant there were no differences in processes to explore further, and it allowed them to treat both groups of patients the same as they developed changes to test. In projects where you suspect an important difference between groups, you may want to use statistical analysis to identify your vital few causes. Again, if you're interested in learning more about statistical analysis, such as chi-squared and ANOVA tests, look to your improvement professionals for help. If your data won't work with statistical analysis or Pareto chart, the final strategy to filter root causes is more qualitative, using frequency, impact, and controllability to create a prioritization matrix. A prioritization matrix is a grid based on your root cause analysis that maps factors according to highest impact, frequency, and controllability. Let's walk through a clinical example where endocrine patients weren't getting imaging prior to follow-up appointments. The team mapped the current state and documented the potential causes and root causes. They came up with reasons that are not easily quantifiable, such as patients not scheduling imaging because patients don't call back, or orders expiring and no one checks for expirations. They weren't able to tally and create a Pareto chart, so this is a great use of a prioritization matrix. First, they created the grid. Impact is the vertical axis. Frequency is the horizontal axis. These two variables are often enough. This example also has an additional variable, control, because it helps them prioritize. The size of each bubble reflects how much control the team has over a cause. The bigger the bubble, the more control. Next, they determined where each potential root cause fits in the matrix. In this case, the team originally ranked high, medium, and low, without a whole lot of definition for what a high meant and what a low meant. They had to rethink what was really high versus medium to spread them out and make the chart more useful. Last, they identified the causes with the highest impact and frequency that are within the team's control for prioritization. In this case, not checking for current orders and no appointment reminder bubbled to the top for highest impact, frequency, and control. The team could also consider working on lab staff not knowing to scroll. It might be easy to implement since it's easily within the team's control. The prioritization matrix is a pretty cool tool because it allows you to move forward where many other teams get stuck. It's better to get actionable data and start learning from experiments than to keep spinning as you try to get 100% accurate data. Before we finish, I want to share the ending to my diet experiment. Once I drilled into my evening snacking habits using a Pareto chart and chi-square test, I was then able to limit my Cheetos by getting one bowl instead of the whole bag. And that made a big difference. So in your next improvement project, before choosing what to work on, figure out what kind of data you have. If you are able to easily measure frequency, prioritize by using a Pareto chart. If you need to measure impact, run a statistical analysis, perhaps with help. Or if your data is more qualitative, build a prioritization matrix. Understanding your vital few causes through these methods of analysis will help you to prioritize root causes and focus on experiments that really make a difference. Once you finish this step, join us in the next video to learn to translate your vital few causes into drivers and come up with your first pass of changes to test.